Not at all. My pleasure, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I have a long-standing interest in the Wars of Independence, and perhaps with Robert Bruce in particular. And just thinking about the start of this, I've called it Robert Bruce in Life and Death. We face the challenge, as always, of how to get close to the past and individuals in the past, how we seek to bridge the gap between us and them. And the answer to that, of course, lies in the evidence. It was interesting looking at the SQA spec for the higher courses and the definition of evidence on page 57, and I noticed that it didn't include evidence of visual or physical nature, evidence relating what we might call material culture. And I think it's maybe worth thinking about that and its advantages that it may confer in trying to bridge that gap. So I'm going to talk today briefly about not one but two Glasgow projects, actually. The one I was involved in, which is the one on the left there, trying to create a new facial depiction of Robert Bruce, King of Scots, but also the one that colleagues in Antarian had completed before our one came along, seeking to recreate the tomb of Robert Bruce, about which we have quite a lot of contemporary documentary evidence. It seems to me that biography is one of the ways in which one can seek to bridge that gap effectively. And if one's thinking about how one sets out in teaching the course at school level or university level, perhaps doing so through individuals, and biography is an effective way of doing it. It's certainly how I start my course on the War of Independence at Glasgow. And I start with Bruce, and not Bruce in a triumphalist sense, but Bruce really as a figure who brought war of a devastating nature to his own kingdom, to much of northern England and to Ireland as well. So it's really starting with thinking about the pity of war and the suffering that this Holocaust of war generated in the early 14th century and its impact upon Bruce himself. He may have been, for reasons that he felt were justified, a warmonger, if you want to put it that way, but he lost his four brothers to the war. His sister Mary ended up encased in a cage suspended from the ramparts of Roxburgh Castle, and the war broke Bruce's own health. And we get various documents within the war which visit this theme, this trope of the sufferings of Robert Bruce, what Bruce went through in order to restore Scottish independence. And I think what I'm particularly interested in here today is the way in which we can use the evidence of Bruce in life and death, his own physique, his own body, if you like, in life and death, just to investigate the way in which he sought to use it to fulfill his two key objectives, namely one, to legitimise his kingship, and two, to legitimise Scotland as a sovereign Christian kingdom under God. So I think it's a case of trying to connect these two things, which may seem at the first, Bruce the man, the physical human being in life and death, and Bruce in terms of what he tried to do in his career, try and connect those perhaps to get students really thinking about it. So we have two videos, two virtual videos, one relating to each project, and it might be worth seeing if I can call these up and give you a taster of them. Don't want to spend too long on them just now, but just to show you, these are available through the Glasgow University website. So that's a taster of the website on the facial reconstruction that was produced by Media Services. The one on the reconstruction of the tomb is, I think, it doesn't have a soundtrack, but in many ways it's more effective as it shows how colleagues at the Antarian and the National Museums of Scotland took the poor relics that remain, these tiny fragments, you'll see one or two of them in a second as they appear, and used these to reconstruct the tomb of Robert Bruce. So it's quite an impressive piece of digital technology, quite powerful. So just an outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the SQA spec and assessment. That was as much for my benefit as anyone else's, or more for my benefit, just so I could try and think about things I could say that would usefully map onto the course and its assessment. Say a brief word about each project, think about the resources that the projects generated, of which those videos are a part, and then lastly think about how these might be applied to the SQA course. So there's the spec for the course itself and the main themes, with Scottish identity prominent, and Bruce is given a section in that course, which is, as I say, to do with the triumph of Bruce, and I think it is worth perhaps dwelling on the other side of that as well. In terms of the exam paper, which the students deal with ultimately in terms of assessing this course, the key words coming across in the spec were contexts and sources and issues, and then there's these 4 types of question that can occur within that exam paper. So I have tried to think about ways in which one could maybe seek to build, as it were, the end into the beginning, build the questions they're going to deal with into the way one actually teaches the course. So we'll come to that towards the end, but that's very much your territory, and you can enlighten me on that and ways in which you think this material might be adapted to suit the course. And then there's the assignment, and I think there are perhaps good opportunities coming out of these 2 projects relating to assignment. We'll touch on those, come back to us at the end. Well, Bruce, we don't have any compelling contemporary visual image of Bruce. Here we see, and this is developing this theme of the material culture of the past. Seals, obviously vitally important, and there's the 2 sides of one of the great seals of Robert as king. The king as fount of justice, the king as protector of his kingdom and leader of the army in war. The top one there, as you may gather, very much touched up by 19th century antiquarians, and then the coin as well. And we're dealing here with images which are obviously very formulaic and don't really help us in getting close to the person concerned. Visual depictions of anything really relating to the War of Independence are later and limited in what they can perhaps tell us. There's Bannockburn, as it appears, 100 and more years and more in Walter Bower's Scotichronicon of the mid 15th century. We have the visuals of key documents, none more famous than the Declaration of Arbroath itself, which some of you may have seen on exhibition in the National Museums of Scotland in the summer, with seals attached. And of course, this is one of the texts which gives us a word portrait of Bruce in terms of that theme of Bruce's sufferings. We come to the modern era, and as it were, the continuation of Bruce's place within Scottish history and the life of the nation in terms of 19th and 20th century statuary. One on the right coming from Bannockburn itself, and based upon the actual material culture we're going to be talking about in a second. Movies, of course, give their own visuals and probably offer good ways in terms of engaging with students. But our starting point for our project was Dunfermline, medieval mausoleum of the Scottish royal dynasty, and a tomb discovered there in 1818 and investigated properly by the standards of the day on the 5th of November 1819, leading to a detailed report published in 1821, from which these images on the left come, and the skeleton inside encased in 2 layers of lead. Once these were opened up, at the bottom image there, we have the image, and you'll notice the signs of bone loss around the face, but also notice the way in which the sternum, the rib cage, has been opened up, and we'll come back to that. A plaster cast was taken of that skull, and that's important to note, that all we have is the plaster cast. We don't actually have the bone itself. All of the skeleton was essentially reburied once the investigations had taken place. We do have bone fragments. We'll come to those which have survived, which didn't make it back into the burial, but there was this problem of access to DNA, which I'll touch on again. So that plaster cast of the skull, which has spawned various other copies since, has been the basis of modern depictions of Robert Bruce. This one is quite a well-known from 1998 by Richard Neve, and this depicts Bruce with leprosy. You'll see the visible signs of that, but there's also, you'll notice, evidence of battle scarring, which Neve was disposed to see as present within the skull. What got me thinking about the possibility of doing a fresh reconstruction was the in employing the latest technology was the Richard III project, which I found very compelling. And it was in the wake of that I contacted Caroline Wilkinson, pictured there, and we embarked on doing the project with her outfit FaceLab to exploit the advances that had been made in technology as contained in the quotation there. But the advantage they had, as I say, is that in their case they had a skeleton, they had bone to deal with, and DNA analysis therefore could give them information about issues such as hair colour, eye colour, and analysis of bone can also give you important information about other factors such as the presence of disease. These slides simply indicate the process from Caroline's point of view and how data was built up in terms of the fact that this was a male ethnicity, Caucasoid ancestry, the condition of the teeth, an important indicator of age, giving a bracket. Bruce sits in the middle of that bracket. Further analysis indicating presence of very powerful muscle, confirming bone loss in various locations around that skull. She did not see any sign of healed wounds or trauma in her examination of the skull. So that was a departure from previous orthodoxy. There is no doubt that this individual, whoever he was an exceptionally strong individual. One can tell this from the ways in which the muscles would have attached to this particular skull. So the data was built up to give us finally this full face reconstruction, simply having to rely on statistical probabilities in terms of issues such as hair colour and eye colour, but relying on contemporary evidence and the expertise of colleagues. Ralph Moffat, curator of European Arms and Armour at Kelvin Grove, to fill in other details, the helmet there and the crown. And we know from the first morning of Bannockburn that Bruce would have been thus accoutred on that day, and it was the crown on his head which enabled Henry de Bohun famously to identify him and to engage him in single combat. We'll come back to that. And you see the presence here on the right-hand side. We did one without leprosy and then one with evidence for mild leprosy on that right-hand side. And a 3D version has also been created, and we're hoping that can be used as the focal point for exhibition at the Hunterian in the future. Now, it's very interesting to look at the way in which the experts went about their business in 1819 in investigating this tomb. There was clearly an absolutely overwhelming desire to make this Bruce. This had to be Bruce, and so various proofs were attested in addition to the evidence, the primary evidence of the skeleton, etc. itself. So there was a supposed crown of lead or cloth, which ultimately mysteriously disappeared. There was a small stone head, which was meant to look like Bruce. However, they worked that out. Again, that's been proved to be of a later date, a different type of stone as well. Damage to the skull. Those at the time were determined to make this the warrior king bearing scars of his battles. It was claimed that a tomb nearby had also been discovered containing a female skeleton. We know from the historical sources that Bruce's second wife and Queen Elizabeth de Burgh was buried beside him at Dunfermline. But again, this has come to nothing. And then most egregiously of all was the copper nameplate discovered a few days after, the 5th of November 1819, bearing the name Robertus Scotorum Rex. This seemed to kind of clinch it. There would actually have been a nameplate on the coffin. So they wanted it to be Bruce. They also claimed that the skeleton, this individual would have been taller than modern scientific estimates would make it. It's reckoned that this would have been an individual of 5'6" to 5'8" or 9" or so. They also employed the contemporary pseudoscience of phrenology to read the skull and the contours of the skull, and surprise, surprise, this revealed very powerful qualities in terms of leadership, kingly qualities. That copper nameplate, this was exposed as a fake subsequently, and here's a letter a colleague discovered and just passed on to me from the National Library of Scotland, revealing the kind of scepticism that there was this initial wave of optimism. This was Bruce that found Bruce, and then we get this wave of skepticism coming in as people begin to look at the evidence more carefully. Some said he was King Robert, others said nay. Some said we'll make him so, be who he may. So just revealing that awareness of this insistence going beyond the evidence that this must be Bruce. And it's clear that the public hoo-ha surrounding the discovery of the tomb and the investigation of the tomb generated if you like, a trade in artifacts that not all bones, etc., made their way back into the tomb, or other bones were used instead. This is an artifact that was brought to our attention through the project, and it claims to be fragments of metatarsal bone, of toe bone and coffin wood, which were taken from the excavation at Dunfermline on the 5th of November 1819. We are hoping to investigate this. 7 benchmarks came out of this, which in one of the articles that came out of the project, I went through on a systematic basis just to try and provide a fresh evaluation of the likelihood that this was indeed the skeleton of Robert Bruce. So in terms of gender and ethnicity, there's a fit. The age, as I said, fits. This issue of physique, very, very powerful individual, and we know that this squares with Bruce. I'll touch on this in a minute. The presence of leprosy. We have contemporary documentary evidence, chronicle evidence, not unanimous, but certainly present, that Robert Bruce died of leprosy, and this was what Caroline Wilkinson saw in that skull. You'll remember that the sternum had been sawn through and opened up, and one of the things we absolutely know about Robert Bruce is that his heart was removed and sent with the faithful James Douglas and other Scots on a kind of tour through continental Europe, ultimately aiming to reach the Holy Land and participate in the crusade, which Bruce had been able to participate in during his lifetime. Tomb location. We know that Bruce was buried from the other sources in the middle of the choir, and there's a case of weighing that up to see if that fitted. It does seem to do so. And finally, the manner of death. You may remember, if we flash back to the visual image of this, you'll see there that the neck, the vertebrae of the neck, appear to be intact. And this is important because the other main rival for Bruce, if we're thinking about who this could be, would be Alexander III, who died in 1286. Alexander, of course, died falling off a cliff, going over a cliff and having his neck broken, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that in terms of this individual. So my own reading of that, and this is an article, part 2, the 4 articles that we produced, I've listed them at the end. Part 1 covers the scientific analysis by Caroline, and part 2 covers what I've just been talking about on this slide, using these benchmarks to weigh up the balance of probabilities, weigh up the evidence, and ask if we think this is Robert Bruce or not. And I came to a positive conclusion on that front. The other project, taking these fragments from the National Museums of Scotland and the Hunterian's collections and putting them together to provide a depiction of the tomb, which we believe this box tomb with effigy and canopy would have sat above the burial vault where the skeleton was discovered in 1818. So here's just a summary of the project resources, which might be of use to you if you think you can make use of this material. There are the videos, the virtual exhibitions for both the face and the tomb, and there are these various artifacts contained at the Hunterian with visual images of them. If you click on the links to various other bits and bobs, shrouds of cloth, shrouds of lead, and fragments left from the coffin, as well as these fragments of marble, etc. And here's the list of articles that we produced. The top one there is really a thought piece by myself, which is actually in the SATH yearbook for 2018, really trying to deal with that question of how we get back to somebody like Bruce and weighing up the physical evidence of the project against the more conventional historical evidence and the types of portraits that we get there, portraits in words. And we have some quite intimate ones, particularly the papal legates who visited Scotland in 1317, and have left a very, very compelling word portrait of Bruce, which I think really takes us as close as one can get through words to the personality, character of the king. And then the 3 project articles, the technical one, part 2, assessing the tomb, the likelihood of it being Bruce, as I've just done, and then part 3, which is more specifically trying to work out what that evidence, how Bruce would have fitted into the internal architecture of Dunfermline, and who else might have been buried alongside him. Now, thinking finally about how one might apply this to the teaching of the course, it seemed to me that there might be mileage in thinking about Bruce's body and his tomb as sources in themselves, and using that as a means to engage students. What can we learn from each other? We treat them as sources in the same way that we treat the declaration of Arbroath or Barber's Bruce as a source. So what can we take from the body in the first place? How close can that get us to Bruce and his not only his physical appearance, but what Bruce tried to do? The nature of his physique, as we can deduce it from the skull, and tells us that he was clearly someone of high social status, privileged in terms of the diet that he would have had. It tells us that he was, in Caroline Wilkinson's phrase, a super athlete of his day, and that translates into the qualities of endurance that we know Bruce possessed, and also the qualities in battle, epitomised especially by that single combat with Henry de Bohun on the first morning of Bannockburn, when Bruce rose in his stirrups above Bohun, got his axe down upon his helmet with such force that he clove both helmet and skull in two, and that was a critical element in the Scottish victory at Bannockburn. But more than that, perhaps, Bruce as a king had to legitimise himself in various ways, and the documents of the time tell us that war was a key aspect here, that Bruce was seeking to legitimise his status as King of Scots by the sword, by his ability to protect his kingdom through war. So I think that the physique can be connected very well to that aspect, that vital aspect of Bruce. On leprosy, there's the very interesting question of how the sources treat this, that we have a reluctance on the part of Scottish sources like Barber to admit that Bruce had leprosy, non-Scottish sources which do so. Now it's been argued that they have been biased in doing so, that they wanted to associate Bruce with a disease regarded with superstition and dread. But I weigh that up in the article part 2 and come to the conclusion that the sources concerned, these English and continental chronicles, were probably acting with good knowledge and in good faith in terms of what they tell us about how Bruce died. That's an interesting one, I think, in terms of weighing up different types of sources and what they tell us. And one of those questions for the exam papers is a case of doing exactly that. And then there's Bruce's heart, the removal of the heart from the body, and its pilgrimage, if you like, towards the Holy Land. That tells us so much, I think, not only about Bruce's piety, but about his use of his own body as propaganda, the way in which Bruce was continuing to fight the cause to which he devoted his adult life, even in death. Others may now have needed to animate that body. Bruce could no longer do so, but he was effectively still pulling the strings in a remarkable way. And the aim here was profound. It was to legitimise him as king and legitimise Scotland as a fully fledged independent sovereign kingdom. These were the big Bruce war aims, and I think the body takes us there. Likewise, the tomb, using the sort of evaluation elements from the SQA spec, we know that the tomb was constructed in a Parisian workshop using Italian marble, that it was modelled on the tombs of the medieval French royal dynasty, who were buried at Saint Denis, close to Paris. And we know that it was buried at Dunfermline, where other Scottish evil monarchs were buried in the middle of the choir. We know this happened in 1329, of course, the year of Bruce's death, but Bruce had been planning this, a document tells us, since 1314. Again, we have Bruce ahead of the game, always thinking ahead and always thinking strategically. And that tomb, of course, is absolutely unquestionably a statement of Scottish sovereignty and Scottish independence under God. So again, it's all about fulfilling these crucial war aims. So thinking then about assessment, finally, and how one might apply this material to assessment within the SQA framework. I've just chucked in, the body and the tomb to the sort of framework of exam questions, just to see what you think about that, the extent to which one could actually do that and use these as evidence. One could adapt these, of course, and be more specific, and the bottom left there does that with the evaluation question. Why did Bruce choose to have a separate heart burial? Why did Bruce choose to be buried at Dunfermline in the manner he did, using that particular type of tomb? And then on the other side, thinking about the assignment and whether elements of these projects, whether these projects could be adapted to enable students to do their assignment. It seems to me there's a lot of potential there. One could have them weigh up this type of physical material evidence with, against other sources, more conventional sources like documents or chronicles, which brings us closest to Bruce. Is it the Declaration of Arbroath, or that skull from Dunfermline, or Bruce's tomb from Dunfermline? There's the question of Bruce and propaganda, I think, which is such a hallmark of his career, and again something in which he excelled. And both the use of the body and the burial, I think, fit very well into that. There is this fascinating business of Bruce's own medical history. We know quite a bit about this beyond what I've said already. We know about who Bruce's doctors were, that he had doctors of the highest caliber from the Gallic world and from the continental European tradition. That tells you a lot about Bruce's own horizons. And students perhaps could think about that and weigh up that whole question of leprosy, because that does take you into interesting places, as I've said, in terms of the sources and this bifurcation between Scottish sources on the one hand and what they say, and these other English and continental sources. And perhaps finally, and I don't know if this would be legitimate within the remit, but could one look at the investigation at Dunfermline in 1819 about what it says about Scottish identity at that point in time? Scottish identity is, after all, highlighted in the spec as fundamental to this course, and there's much one can learn about Scotland. I think Scottish identity seeking still to be distinctive, but within the context of Union and Empire, through a project like that. Finally, then, just some further readings that haven't been mentioned so far. The top one is that detailed report about the excavation carried out at Dunfermline in 1819, and then some other articles beyond our project articles, dealing with various aspects that are relevant here, Bruce and ceremonial. There's an article by Caroline Proctor to do with Bruce's doctors, and then the article by Grant Simpson, which is very useful in talking about heart burial within a European context, and Bruce's what Bruce's motives may have been for the way in which the arrangements he made for dealing with his own heart post-mortem. Okay, that's me, and I'll stop there. Thanks very much.